Right, so I'm going to get started now, guys. Just give you a bit of an introduction before we start looking at the numerous photos I've put together for you this evening. Yeah, thanks for coming on board. Last time we looked, there was nearly 400 people signed up to this evening, which is fantastic. I really didn't expect that much of an interest for this, so that's quite humbling. I hope it is of interest. For some of you, you might never have heard of the Royal Observer Corps before, but hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll know a little bit more about them. So just to give you a bit of an agenda of what I'm going to go through tonight with you all. So first of all, just give you a very brief history on the Royal Observer Corps, how they came about, their role in World War II, onto the Cold War, so talking about what happened there. Stand down of the Observer Corps, what happened to the monitoring posts that we're going to talk about as well in a minute. And then on to the Royal Observer Corps post at Cuckfield, which Ed Coombs and myself look after them, restored, and allow the public to come down and visit. But I'm going to tell you quite a bit more about that in a bit. So as Tony said, Ed's going to be on the chat tonight because I've got quite a bit to go through. He'll be answering anything, any questions that you've got as we go. If at the end there's anything else that we need to cover, we can go back and do that. So just to talk about the photos that we're going to go through tonight, as I say, there's quite a lot of them. There's about 160. So I'm going to be going through at quite a pace at some of them. Some of them we're going to slow down a bit more on and spend a bit more time on. Most of these photos are mine, particularly the ones of bunkers that we're going to look at later on. A lot are also Ed Coombs, which are also on the Time Chamber, which is his website he does with his brother Nick. We've also got permission from some other people, and I'd like to say thanks for that. We're using someone from Subterranean Britannica, the Royal Observer Corps Association, the Royal Observer Corps Heritage Group, lots of other great people have given us the go-ahead to use some photos. So hopefully they'll be interesting. There might be some you haven't seen before either. So just a very quick disclaimer before I get started on this, guys. I was not in the Royal Observer Corps. I'm 41 at the moment, so I was at school when the Observer Corps was stood down. So I'm not a historian. This is a hobby for me, and I do know we've got some ex-Observer Corps personnel on today. So I apologise now if I get something not quite right, or I miss something, or I get my historical information slightly wrong. As I say, I'm doing this voluntarily just to give a bit more of an insight in the course, so hopefully that's helpful. Good, right, so let's get started. I'm going to turn the webcam off now because you don't want to look at my ugly mug throughout. I'd rather you be looking at the pictures. So I'm just going to turn the camera off. Okay, good. So for those of you who've never heard of the Royal Observer Corps, or the RSC, as we're going to call them quite a bit tonight, the history starts back in 1925 when they were first formed. They were a civil defence volunteer organisation, so it's important to be aware they weren't a military unit. They're intended to aid in a visual detection, identification, tracking and reporting of aircraft over the UK. So their roots actually go back to the First World War, when there was a requirement for a warning system to bolster UK defences against bombing raids by Zeppelin airships. But by the outbreak of World War II, what was then known as the Observer Corps had their role expanded. So they would become the eyes and ears on the ground detecting and tracking German aircraft over the UK. That's a German aircraft over London. And there's some dropping their bombs. So this was how the Observer Corps would have first started out, just a pair of binoculars standing on top of a building looking out for aircraft. But by 1938, there was about 1,400 Observer Corps posts throughout the UK, but with a very high density in the southeast for obvious reasons. During World War II and the Blitz and the Battle of Britain in particular, these operated 24/7 with crews doing shift around their normal employment, and they were absolutely pivotal in making sure we could win that battle. So as you can see, the posts were just very basic to start with, just a couple of chaps with a pair of binoculars, radio. But as time went on, as you can see in these pictures here, they would then start to give them maybe a bit of tarpaulin, a garden shed, or some cover from the elements. So things were improved as they went along. So eventually they were replaced by more substantial brick-built structures, sandbags or other materials. So these observation posts were located on top of buildings, playing fields, fields where animals were grazing, cliff tops, so anywhere that they could get good sight of aircraft. There's some ladies there in the observer call. So information that was gathered by the observer call was passed by radio to a group control, which in turn was passed to RAF Fighter Command Sector, which is basically to ensure that the RAF resources were deployed at the right time to intercept the incoming Luftwaffe fighters and bombers. So as well as this, posts also later in the war had the job of tracking devastating V1 and V2 attacks. So the basic binoculars were soon given a new edition of a post instrument, which you can actually see in this picture here. So this is something called the Mickelthwaite, if I pronounce that correctly. This basically meant that posts could now report not only what aircraft was in the air by identifying them, but also plotting the height, the speed, and the numbers of aircraft. So the work that they were doing was of paramount importance, as I say. So by 1941, the Observer Corps, as they were known at the time, was granted Royal by the King. So they then formally became the Royal Observer Corps. There's a couple of pictures there. These are the group controls in World War II, just to give an idea, quite basic compared with some photos you'll see a bit later on. But this is them actually plotting aircraft throughout the UK. So we're going to move forward a bit. As I say, this presentation is going to cover a huge amount of time within a very short period. So on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, the world changed. The Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the targets of the first detonations of nuclear weapons in anger in the history of mankind. An estimated 250,000 people were killed in an instant. Whilst the events of this meant the surrender of Japan and the final end of World War II, the world had seen the power of this new weapon. So other countries, as well as the United States, wanted to start having some of these of their own. So the Americans had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, but it only lasted about 4 years before the Soviet Union, that was then around, detonated their first atomic bomb. In 1949 test, I've got written down here. So the United States responded with the development of something called the hydrogen bomb. This was a nuclear weapon estimated 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Japan during World War II. So we generated something called MAD, as it was known at the time, which was mutually assured destruction. And this became a key part of what then became the Cold War. So with NATO and the Warsaw Pact ensuring they had each other's, they had enough weapons so that they could stop each other pressing the button and discourage like a preemptive attack. So for those of you that know your history and locations, this is Berlin, and this is a place called Checkpoint Charlie, which you can still go and visit today if you go to Berlin. It doesn't quite look like that now. But in the 1950s, the Cold War did begin to escalate. And then throughout the 50s, 60s, there was a heightened risk of people pressing these buttons. And we had heightened threats in Berlin. As you can see there, that's American and Soviet Union troops facing each other. We had military build-ups by the US, Soviet troops and NATO. And at one point, we had the near start of World War III due to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And other crises that we had in the world. So how does Britain start to fit back into this? So we were a key ally of the US, and that meant that we were always going to be on the front line. I will leave this slide up for you. You might not be able to see it all completely as we go, but this actually shows you a probable target list of Soviet sites within the UK. Again, this is estimated. This isn't historical accuracy, but it starts to give you an idea of the sites that we had in the UK that would have been on the front line. So the UK actually had troops deployed in Europe, ready to fight alongside NATO and US forces. And Britain became the United States' what was called the unsinkable aircraft carrier. So we had US Air Force bases all along the East Coast. You can see quite a lot of them there today. And US Air Force bases for tactical reconnaissance, strike command, thousands of troops, and also storage of nuclear weapons throughout the UK. Funny enough, for those of you who might have seen the news today, a US plane actually went down just off the coast of Yorkshire, I think it was. So they do actually still have a presence in the UK today. So with that in mind, the United Kingdom started up something called, I'm going to change my notes, something called the UKWMO. That was the United Kingdom Warning and Monitoring Organisation. So what they had to do was they had to draw up plans as how to deal with the real threat in the event of World War III, how we could defend ourselves and prepare and plan for full-on nuclear war and attacks by numerous atomic weapons, which would cause widespread death, misery, devastation and chaos throughout the UK. So the UK government at the time actually went against building large nuclear shelters and bunkers for the majority of people. Their concern was that if millions were to survive a prolonged attack, there'd be no way of feeding them, sheltering them in a country that'd be probably without food, water, sanitation, medical care, and any chance of surviving a post-nuclear world. So it was decided that they would only build protective accommodation for the military, government, local authority, and utilities. So in effect, the public would probably have to fend for themselves. So just to give you a bit more information of stuff that went out at the time, some of you will probably recognise some of these booklets that you've got here. Little bit of propaganda in my opinion, but this actually gives you, the householder at the time, a bit more information about how to survive nuclear war. Some of you might actually think that these booklets that come out are part of history, but we had some come out for Brexit, we had some come out for coronavirus recently. So the government still has ways of actually sending out booklets through our door as and when needed. Just to give you an example of some of the stuff that was actually said at the time, this is actually within the Protect and Survive booklet. So if you're caught out in the open, find a ditch, lay in it. And here you've got pictures of building what was called a refuge room. So that's actually giving yourself protection under the stairs in the event of a nuclear war. And I will leave that for you to make your own decisions on. So just going back to the United Kingdom Warning and Monitoring Organisation. So that was set up in 1957. Its primary role was to provide the military and civilian authorities with data of nuclear explosions. So it had 5 main functions. I'm very briefly going to go over with you. So the first one was warning the public of any air attack, providing confirmation of a nuclear strike, warning the public of the approach of radioactive fallout, and provision of a post-attack meteorological service, so seeing what the weather was doing at the time. So the ballistic missile air warning system for the UK would have come from somewhere called RAF Fylingdales, which is actually up in the North Yorkshire moors. It's on the road to Whitby. You can still see RAF Fylingdales today. It's still up there. The famous golf balls that you can see there look slightly different now, but this is photos of Fylingdales during the Cold War. And there you've got a lovely picture of them in the background with Vulcan bombers flying over it. These pictures were Imperial War Museum, I think they were, that these came from. So this is where your 4-minute warning comes in. So for those of you who know your history, this was a very key part of the Cold War. That this is where the 4-minute warning in effect would have come from. So what you had here was over the horizon radar that would in effect see the launch of nuclear weapons and be able to then warn the public in effect of what was happening, what was about to come and hit them. So this information would would have activated something called the carrier warning system, which was instigated from a nuclear bunker, I understand, RAF High Wycombe. This went on to 250 carrier control points, as they were called. They were located at major police stations and headquarters that would activate 17,000 carrier receiver points. Now, these receiver points were actually based at smaller locations, such as army headquarters, hospitals, fire stations, post offices, and Royal Observer Corps posts, which we'll come back to in a sec. So, how did the Royal Observer Corps fit into all of this? So, to enable them to get all the information they needed at UKWMO, they need a field force to give them all the information that they needed on the ground. So, the Royal Observer Corps actually already had a structure in place that had changed slightly since World War II, had been upgraded, but they still had post sites throughout the UK that were ideally suited to take over the role of the warning and monitoring of a nuclear attack of the UK. So there was already sites that the MOD could immediately use. The main issue they had, though, as you saw from some of those pictures at the beginning, was they couldn't perform their role standing in the middle of a field with a pair of binoculars. So they would need protected accommodation built to give them protection against bomb bursts and the radioactive fallout that you would get from a nuclear weapon. So between 1958 and 1968, there was a UK-wide building programme of protected accommodation for the Royal Observer Corps to work from. 1,563 underground monitoring posts were built, about 7 to 8 miles apart in a grid pattern. These photos here, sorry, are just of the receiver points that I talked about a bit earlier. So yeah, just to go back, so there's 1,563 underground monitoring posts that were built, about 7 to 8 miles apart, usually in a grid pattern of 3 or 4. So they covered the whole of Britain, as far as the Isle of Wight, to the Shetland Islands and across the Northern Ireland. So the posts were actually excavated in a cut and cover basis. So these are pictures of a post in Surrey being built. Thanks to Taris, who's let us use these. So what happened, that there was this was built to a depth of 25 feet, and in it was in effect built a reinforced concrete box that was then waterproofed and covered in soil. And as you can see on these pictures here, this gives you an idea of actually how the depth that these were built. The walls were 6 inches thick. The floor was 12 inches, and it had a ceiling which I understand was about 8 inches thick as well. So quite sort of sturdy things that were built there. So the entry was via a steel ladder in a vertical shaft, which I'll show you more in depth on in a minute, of about 19 feet deep. What you can actually see there with that chap is that's a ventilation shaft that was built. That was just to be able to give air into the bunker. I'll talk to you a bit more later about the actual air in the bunker. And there you can see the entrance hatch being built. And there's the waterproofing going in and the brickwork around it as well. So once they actually got down into the bunker, it gave access to what was called a monitoring room, which was about 16 feet long and 7 feet wide. So it gave 3 to 4 observers space to live and work, which they estimated for up to about 14 days. What they did also build was a separate toilet compartment with a chemical closet, which at least gave them somewhere to go if they needed to, and not have to come back outside to the outside world. So picture you can see here, it's not the best of photos of these couple, but it's the best I could do in a short time. This is the first ROC post that was actually built at Farnham in Surrey. This was in 1956, used for trials in 1957, before all-out building started in 58. There you can see the monitoring that was built. You can actually see a sink in there on the right-hand side. The posts weren't built with sinks in place in the end. And also that thing you can see coming out the vent at the back was not, that was to pull air into the post. They were not used as well. And there's some observers actually testing in the post at the same time as well. So as you might have seen on that first picture I showed you of Farnham, you can see a hatch which actually opens out into like a double hatch. This is a post at Springwell, which was up north, I think Newcastle way, I think it was, near a colliery. So they actually did build some of the observer core posts with those type of hatches, but they were very few and far between, and they went for a hatch all in one, which you'll see in a little bit. So there's an overview there of the observer core post for you. So you can see the ladder that you climb down once you get in the shaft. Then you can see observers there actually working in the post. So once these posts were completed, they became operational quite quickly once the volunteer crews have had the relevant training. It is worth noting, though, that these bunkers were not manned 24/7. They're only crewed on what was called a transition to war period. Which would have been when political dialogue had broken down. You'd have like military build-up, and a threat of war was imminent. So the remainder of the time, apart from the training sessions, weekly checks on the bunker and the equipment, the post was usually empty, locked up, but ready to go. It is worth noting, though, and as you'll see on some of these pictures in a minute of crews, the ROC crews did become very close. There was a huge social side to the Observer Corps, which does still continue today with the Observer Corps Association. So it became a big part of people's lives for a very long time. This actually shows you the way that the UK Warning and Monitoring Organisation broke the country up into sectors and group boundaries. I'll come back to the whole thing about groups in just a minute. And here you can see posts, I think, usually around the 1960s. The reason I wanted to focus on this part of the Corps, first of all, was because in 1968 there was a civil defence review, and so about half of the Observer Corps posts were closed. We had a restructure and a reduction of the Royal Observer Corps and all of its personnel, and a lot of other things within the UK at the time were closed down. I think my understanding that it was more of a money thing, but I could be wrong as to why this review started at the time. So a lot of the posts still do remain from the 1968 closures. As I say, they closed about half of them. The majority of ones that do still survive are in quite bad condition. They're usually quite derelict. But I will show you just a couple of pictures on some very rare survivors of the 68 closures at the time. These photos here are Observer Corps posts in the 60s. And here we've got a couple of ROC posts taken probably in the last sort of 15 years or so by myself that actually show you the condition of some of the very rare ones that we've got throughout the UK. So as you can see there, this is a post that closed in 1968. It's actually still got boxes of ROC equipment still in it. So and they've actually still got some uniform in there as well, quite a rare one. And as you can see on that one, actually, I will just go back one, how nice some of these locations were, which I'll show you some of the nice ones in a minute. This is another 68 closure here. This is in the middle of nowhere in Wales, this post. Very nice owner. It's actually in somebody's, just about someone's back garden. They're very nice. They came and opened it up for us. This is very, very rare to see. That you can actually see not only the beds are in there, they've still got the mattresses in there with the covers on them. There's jerry cans still there. The battery box is still there, and the toilet is even still in its original wrapping. I will talk more about the equipment in just a second. There were some stranger posts built. This is actually the Observer Corps post site in Southsea, very near to where I live at the moment. There was a few unusual posts that were built. This was actually built in a magazine of a gun battery along the front there, long sealed. I think I found the part of the bunker where some of the equipment came out from. But as well as one here, there was one under Windsor Castle, which was quite a strange place. There was also one in the Martello Tower as well built as well. So they weren't all completely the same. So just to give you a carry on with history, I'm conscious of time. So the Observer Corps carried on their work preparing for this nuclear war throughout the 70s and 80s. So I'm going to show you here some photos of several posts in that operational period. Some of these during training, some of them are more some social events as well. So it's worth noting though that these posts were often very Spartan. They were cramped. They were cold in quite a lot of areas because remember these operated all year round at the top of hills as well. And in a lot of cases they got very, very damp. That some crews did make some minor alterations and additions to it to make things more comfortable. But in the main, these would not have been a great place to stay for days on end. So I'm going to walk through a couple of these pictures now with you. These are various photos of operational crews from various bunkers throughout the UK at the time. Worth noting there what that chap's putting up. We're going to talk about the equipment in a second, but just remember what I talk about in a minute when I think back to that probe that you can see that gentleman using there. Just going to stop on this one with you guys just for a sec. As you can see, this is a bit of a different post here. As you can see at the back, you can actually see a sink in the back of the post. And actually, that is what you think it is on the left-hand side, which is actually a microwave. This post in the UK actually was one that can actually go on mains power. I think my understanding is that they all signed up to have mains power put in the post. And so they could actually run a microwave from the bunker. So this is very rare. Most bunkers will run, the majority of them will run off battery. So they have a generator above ground, which would be used to keep the battery charged underground, and then they would only be able to survive off the battery light that they would have underground, which was actually very minimal. So once that battery had run out, that was it. So this was quite rare to have that. This is an Observer Corps place on the Isle of Wight. This is another addition that I was talking about with people making things a bit more comfy for themselves. So what you can actually see here is they've removed their beds out of the post, and they've actually made what looks like like somewhere to sit. So making it a bit more comfortable. And they've also put what looks like a fake window in the back as well, just to make it feel a bit more homely. It does look like lights up on the side there, on the right-hand side. I have been to this post. It does not look anything like this now, but I didn't see any evidence of them having mains power, so I'm really not quite sure whether they did or not, or those were actually lights or not. So just going to touch on this briefly. This is an ROC post in the south. If you can see at the back there, you can see this was an experimental way of actually making the air better in the post. So these Observer Corps posts had no air filtration built in with them. The ventilation shafts that you saw had sort of slight grills over there, but in effect fallout could potentially get in at some point if the slats were open that you can see on those vents. So they were looking at experimental ways of making it safer for the crews for the air that they breathe down there. But by the time this started to really get tested, the Observer Corps finished, so it never got put in every post, so they're quite rare. So it is important, I think, just to briefly explain where the information came from the post went to. So the ROC centres that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation became what was called controls. They provided bomb-proof nuclear protected buildings to work from for up to about 100 personnel, and they included dormitories, kitchen, canteen, decontamination, and like a split level central operations room with a balcony. What you can see here in this picture, this is one of the group controls in the south, privately owned. Was an organised visit to go and see that one. This is one up in Wales. I think it was Wales. I think the name gives that one away. From that one up there, slightly different type of build. So the information that came from these ROC posts, they were collated here from their group. So what they could do is they could actually establish the exact location, height, and power of the nuclear explosions. That was a derelict group control, which now turned into a house. And that's entry to another one down south. So what you can see here, this is inside a group control. I think I would gather this was from the ROC Heritage Association. I would gather it looks sort of 80s. I could be wrong. But what they're doing here, so the information that they got could then be used by sort of scientific advisors, civil defence departments, local authorities, and any other relevant people who needed the information. So this really was the centre of it all. They can see them gathering information. And they're working out what probably is fallout, but again, I'm not as clued up on the group controls. So what's interesting to see actually in the top left, we'll talk about equipment in just a second, but that's a bomb power indicator that they had in the post as well. So it's worth noting that the group controls could also take their own readings of things. So what I'm going to do in just a sec, I'm just going to go through some photos of some equipment with you, just so you've got an idea of the stuff that they used. There's really not enough time to show all the equipment that the Observer Corps used throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s. You could probably do a webinar on that just in itself. The same with these group controls. There's so much to cover in these things that you could do a webinar by itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus more on the 1980s equipment that were in the post, mainly because Cuckfield, that we're going to talk about in a bit, we've set it up as it was in the 1980s. So I am going to focus more on that. But it's worth noting this was at the end of the Observer Corps service rather than earlier on. That's inside a group control in the south. This is after closure, obviously. And that's a group control which is Avon, which I did an organised trip to. It's actually owned by the fire brigade now up there. They use it as their control centre and training place. You can actually see what they've done with their control room there as well. So we've used that. Okay, so hopefully I won't bore you too much with the equipment. So I'm going to be quite high level with this and not go too much detail, but just to give you a very brief introduction as to what this stuff is. So this is on top of a post hatch that you can see the hatch in the background, and that's your access shaft. This is something called a ground zero indicator. What this basically does is means that they can see where the ground zero of the weapon is. So just above where you can see the north, the N, you can see a very small hole. That's like in effect like a pinhole camera. So what would happen is you get the flash of the weapon when it goes off, and it in effect puts a mark on photographic paper, which is underneath. And you can see there the photographic paper underneath the white covering to it. So what actually would do is you think, well, how do they then get to that information when they've got that hatch closed and they're underground? So what they would do is observer number 3, I understand, would need to come up that ladder, change the photographic paper and take it back down into the bunker as quickly as possible so that they can analyse it. My understanding is that that could be done very, very quickly. I'm sure it's something that they did want to practice. This is a bomb power indicator. Again, does what it says on the tin. This shows you the power of the weapon when it goes off. I'm not going to try and explain about kilopascals. Again, that's way beyond my knowledge from here. I'm sure there's ex-observers who could tell us for hours about how it works, because I think this also changed a couple of times. But this is how they actually took readings of how powerful that bomb was. This is a baffle plate above ground, which is where in effect, when you get a blast wave come across, the air would in effect go down that baffle plate so they could take a reading on that bomb power indicator. Again, that's the real basics of it as to how that works. Just going to touch on something called the fixed survey meter. This takes readings of radiation on the surface. So within the post, what they had was a probe, which I showed you earlier in a couple of pictures being operated. They would actually stick that probe up what was in effect like a big drain pipe, which went then back out into the surface, and then would be put up through here so that they could take readings of radiation and fallout on the surface. Very important job post nuclear attack, because even the areas that had no nuclear weapons hit are still under very big danger of fallout. So very important part of the readings. This is part of the communications kit. This is where your 4-minute warning comes through in effect in the bunker. This is also how they would communicate through these systems to group control, but this would actually set off at the time where they needed to batten down the hatches. And this is a teletalk. This is how they talk to the group control. As I said before I went through these, this is right at the end of the edition of how they talk to group control. But you've got the post number there, which is actually Cuckfield, that we're going to talk about in just a sec. And they could communicate then between posts and to group control. 1 in 3 posts was a master post, which meant if landline failed, which was quite a big possibility, they could pump up an aerial and use a radio to go through. As I say, that wasn't in every post. So you've got your siren. These were at the top of, would have been outside the post, obviously, when they were stood to. So when a 4-minute warning would come through, they would go up, start the siren to give the local area a warning of incoming nuclear attack. They would also then do fallout warnings through the siren as well. These maroons were also another way of warning the public against fallout. So if fallout was coming into an area, they could set these off, and they would do 3 big bangs in the air, again to warn people to take cover because of fallout. This gives you an idea of rations that were kept in the post. Really not very nice. Ed and I have tried a couple of these over the years just to see how they were, and I really wouldn't recommend it. These ones that we have in the post were from 1990, and they're still here, but these would have been issued to posts in that transition to war that we were talking about. Just on the rations, actually, just before I go on this, just to say there was no mains water to the post as well. We saw earlier some jerry cans in the post, so water was kept in the post there as well. So just to touch on these 2 pictures here, again, this is a very long bit of the core covered in a few seconds. These are what were called all-it posts. This was about aircraft recognition, usually post-war, and it shows you where they built monitoring posts on sites that already had aircraft recognition. This became quite redundant very quickly as aircraft got faster, because obviously by the time you heard aircraft, they'd gone past. So these all-it and aircraft posts became quite redundant as time went on. You can still see them at various post sites throughout the UK. Now you can see a lovely post site there. That's with a World War II site in the background for the Observer Corps as well, which I understand has been listed, which is great. So just to bring you further on in time. So in 1991, following a defence spending review, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the continued development of new technology, the Royal Observer Corps was stood down. It was felt the posts were no longer required. Some personnel did stay on and work with the Ministry of Defence in what were called nuclear reporting cells, and they were at military sites throughout the UK. But in 1995, sadly, the last remaining ROC crews were also stood down. So what became of these 870 odd bunkers that were left at the end at stand down? So some were demolished immediately, some reverted back to owners of the land, some fell into disrepair, some have been over the years completely vandalised, they've been set fire to, some are in a very, very poor state. Finding ones in a good state, it seems to be becoming rarer and rarer now throughout the UK. There is thankfully some time capsules still out there. I'm not going to name any of these posts, but this gives you an idea of some of the stuff that thankfully is still out there for people to see, and hopefully people to see for years to come. So I will tell you where this post is, because it's one of my favourites, and it doesn't look like this anymore. This is freshwater on the Isle of Wight. As you can see, some of the lovely locations that they did actually build these bunkers. I'll just show you a couple of these now. That's a strange post site. That's actually at RAF Northolt, which is an operational Air Force base, which we've got permission to go and see. Just shows you where they built them also in funny locations. That's the middle of an industrial estate down south. And then you come across ones like this that weren't actually built underground at all. It seems to me that they built the post and just covered it in earth. So what happened there, I don't know. Most of them do become quite overgrown. To get to this post took quite a while to cut back. And then some of them still have signs, as you can see there. And then you get the very overgrown post, which you can see. This is actually the post at Weybridge, which is now demolished. But what's quite nice is all the post members actually signed the hatch when they left. So here you go. I'm going to flick through these relatively quickly because I'm conscious of time as well. But these are just some 91 closures throughout the UK that are still in a relatively good condition. Thankfully, most of these are kept secure and locked up or in people's gardens, which I think has helped them. As you can see, you can even still find equipment in some, but less as time goes on. Here's something just to show you very quickly. Posts built backwards. There's a couple of these throughout the UK. Why they were built like that, I take it that it's probably because the contractors just read the drawings wrong, but some of them are actually built back to front, which you, as I say, can find out there. And some, as I say, even did additions. That's a post where they built a sink in the chemical toilet room. So that brings me on to Cuckfield and what we've done at Cuckfield. So this is actually the plan of the sites in the 90s. This is post 50 we're going to be talking about, which is Cuckfield. First came across this bunker when I read a book called The Attack Warning Red, which I'll come back to in just a second. What was happening at the time was I was looking for a bunker one of these bunkers to restore. I'd been to about 900 by the time I'd been to this, so I was documenting quite a few. I just thought it'd be nice just to restore one. So I came across this post at Cuckfield, which was in relatively good condition. I actually went to a couple of council meetings with the parish council, who are the owners, in 2008, 2009. They gave the go-ahead for the post to be restored. What you can see here are some older pictures of Cuckfield. This is, I think, Ed might be able to, hopefully he's still on. Ed might be able to just remind me of this. I think this is 60s, early 70s of Cuckfield Post, when the Orlet the aircraft post was still there. That was demolished, I think, in the 70s because it isn't there anymore. There's a couple of other pictures there of Cuckfield. And there's a crew, again, I think in the 1970s, down at Cuckfield Post, having a bit of fun. And this is Cuckfield Post in the 80s from there. So just to show you what we've done down here. So as I say, restoration of this post started in around about 2009. Ed Coombs came along and started as well, and this became a joint collaboration from both of us. What you can see here is the post when we first started. You can see it's not in the greatest of conditions, but compared with some out there, it was not too bad. But just to give you an idea of what we were dealing with when we both started. So concrete wasn't in great condition, the hatch wasn't great. But underground wasn't too bad. As you can see, it's not flooded, it's not burnt out, it's not vandalised. So it was in okay enough condition to start from, we thought. So we started restoration. There's the chemical loop. we started restoration, first of all, pulling out what were rotten floorboards under the, what you can see there, that matting was issued to some posts to try and keep the cold out. But underneath was some rotting flooring, which we needed to take out. That was a horrendous day's work trying to get that out because it all fell apart as we tried to do it. All the rotten fibres everywhere. It was horrendous. But we got all of that out, and then we could start painting. So we started painting the walls, as you can see there. We started to bring the odd bit of equipment back down into the post. This was actually a work day when it snowed. As you can see, I was very keen back then. I still went down there on days it snowed. There's Ed, looking a bit strange, but I think it was just the way the picture was taken at the time. This is Ed actually clearing out the sump, which is where the any water in the post we put into and then pumped out. That included any toilet waste as well. This is Ed there with the illustrious job of doing that. And there's me putting the beds together. So we were given a set of bunk beds from another post, which we put in. Again, getting those back into a bunker is easier said than done. And there's the hatch before we started. And there's a very overweight me actually painting the hatch. And you can see the work we've done on it there as well. God, it's in the packet of biscuits there on the top. Look, isn't that terrible? This gives you an idea. This was actually a couple of years after restoration, just show you the ongoing work we have to do down there. So a bit of concrete literally fell off at one point. So Ed, it's the DIY man, so you can see some work being done there to bring it back to normal. That's just one job that takes a whole day down there, so it's quite a big undertaking. So this was just before opening on the first open day. We were just about getting everything down into the post. You can see the beds are all there. And this is a commemorative stone that they've actually got on the hatch upstairs, which we've put in. Look at that briefly. So that's actually taken the original padlocks off. These were the very helpful landowners who looked after the graveyard next door. And weirdly enough, the day they cut the padlocks off so that we could build a better way of locking the hatch, we had a visitor come down the post with the original keys. By then, we'd already taken off the original padlocks, which was very frustrating. There's a very young-looking Ed there. That's with the post fully kitted out before our first open day. And there you can see the finished, this is about 2010, 2011, I think these. And there you can see the finished article that we did down there. So that took about a year to get to that stage, to get it fully operational and to get all the equipment. We've had to buy stuff, we've been loaned it, we've made stuff together ourselves. So it's all taken quite a bit of time. You can see some of the booklets and paperwork that we have out for people to look at on open days. You can see the equipment there in the background as well. It is worth noting actually at this point that the bunker is securely locked and alarmed. We don't leave all this equipment in the post. It is all taken out after open days, and we do strip it over the winter. There's actually, just to show you that map in the background, I know it's not quite clear, that actually shows you all the observer corps posts in the 1970s after the first lot of closures. I don't know if you can quite see it, but you can just about see the dots where each post is. Again, a very overweight me there. This is Lynn Wood. For any of you who've read the book Attack Warning Red, this was the first book I read on the Observer Corps, actually, that got me quite interested in it. This was actually written by a chap called Derek Wood, who actually served at Cuckfield Post, which is quite nice for us that there's that link to history there. This is his widow, Lynn, who's been a very big supporter of us. That was her when we first met her at a thing we did at the museum locally. And she kindly signed our copy of Attack Warning Red, which we keep dearly. That's her a few years later with me and Ed at the post. So it was nice for her to come down and see us. And she did also give us Derek's, that's Derek there in the picture, Derek's medal, which we do put up for people to see when they come down. That's me on a very wet open day. When we started, we were that passionate that we still went down when it was pouring with rain. In those days, we didn't have a proper locking bar, so we had all these chains and padlocks. That just summed it up for me, because it used to take forever to get those padlocks and chains off in pouring rain. So, memories. This is the one show that came down and did an article at the Post. They actually came down and did a small documentary for the one show. This is just some pictures of them when they came down and filmed with us. And oh God, sorry, I've completely variant post. Ed, I'm so apologetic, because he's probably watching this right now. This is the only variant post in Cornwall. He came down and kindly did the Partner Observer Corps for us, so that at least we could make sure all our information was correct. And he came down and did the chat part of it with the BBC. And there he is, still filming. So these are just some photos now, just coming to the end. Lawrence Holmes, that was it. Thank you. I've just returned. Lawrence, my sincere apologies. We've even met a few times as well. Lovely chap. Does a lot of hard work at a post in Cornwall. Yeah, that was Lawrence that came down. So these photos here, these are just from open days. So these are open days from our first one, as I say, was in 2010. We had very few people to start with. Now we get 60 to 80 people at a time. We've seen Ed check the numbers the other day. We've seen over 3,000 people come and visit the post now, which is unbelievable. We thought only a couple of years we'd have people interested, but while people still want to come down and see us, we keep opening. We get huge groups of people come down. And we give them a little chat about the ROC. We give them a bit more information about what went on. So you can see Ed and I there chatting to people. And some days we get absolutely rammed. So that's the day when it was even raining. We can see we've put something up over the hatch there. But at times the compound that the post is in just gets absolutely full of people. So it's quite an undertaking to try and keep, make sure everybody's safe and still give them all the info they need. This is a latter edition that Ed has done, which is great. This also gives people a bit more of information about the work the Observer Corps did during World War II. So we've got a small display now for people to talk about and have a look at for World War II. So although it's not relevant to the Cold War section of it, we just think it's nice for people to have a look at that as well. There's an aerial shot of the post on an open day. So this is basically how we now have it. This was a chap that came down with one of these drones with a camera on it and put it up. It's quite a nice picture, actually. Shows you the compound, shows you the post, shows you all the equipment that we have out, actually shows you the mast that you can see on the ventilation shaft there that we can pump up from the post as well. That's actually me and Ed sitting under out the sun there. Can get quite hot in that field. That's Ed's vehicle. I'll get it wrong and then he'll as to what he calls it in the background there, which is very handy getting all the equipment to and from. And yeah, so that's how we have it set up now for open days. So that was just before the visitors started one morning. So that's I think just to start to sum up now, just conscious of time for you all as well. This was the New York Times photo that they came down to the post and saw us, I think around about 2014, 2015, something like that. So a journalist came over from New York, was doing something else, I think, on the Cold War as well, and came down and photographed the post. We were quite pleased with that for them to come and acknowledge that. So they photographed the bunker as well. There you can see the siren. You might remember I showed you the picture of a siren at the start as well. You can actually see siren up there. So just to sum up, really, just to show you what we've done down there at Cuckfield. That was the post before we started, and that's the post when we finished it. So as I say, that's quite a big undertaking to get it to that point. We're quite pleased with it. We might not have got everything completely correct, but we think it does give people an idea of history. We have lots of different age groups come see the post, they come and see us, they listen to what we talk about the Observer Corps. As I say, hopefully we'll keep it going as long as people still want to come and see us. So, I mean, for obvious reasons, we've not been able to open the post this year. trying to socially distance in a small bunker where even with 4 of you down there feels quite cramped is not the best place to be with a pandemic on. So we've had to sort of scrap all open days for this year, but we are hoping to open again 2021. It does cost us quite a lot to keep the post open. We pay about £400 a year for our public liability insurance. That's just to open it. And then, of course, we've got all the paint, all the upkeep, all the DIY, and everything else that goes with it. So our funds, as you can imagine, are quite decimated at the moment with not having any visitors this year. So please do come and support us next year. We've got a Facebook page as well. We've got links on Subterranean Britannica. So please do come down and support us, and please do give us a donation to keep us going as well, because we don't charge people to come and have a look. Right, I'm going to give you my ugly mug again. We are just coming back to the end. Hopefully you're all still there. Obviously, it's quite weird talking to yourself in one of these things. That's about the end of the webinar that I put together for you guys. As I say, that really was quite a fast history of the Observer Corps, just taking you from World War I, World War II, Cold War, stand down, and on to the restoration of the post as well. So you could probably split each part of that up into onto its own webinar as it is. But again, I hope it was some interesting. A lot of photos to get through, but it was the only way to really show you what things looked like at the time. So this was a webinar we'd done with Subterranean Britannica. This is, I think, their third one. I think that they've done their 4th one. So if you can do one of these webinars, Tony at Subterranean Britannica, I'm sure would like to hear from you, so that they can keep these going. Things are changing a bit out there now. I think they've opened all the shops today and all the rest of it, but I still think this is a good way of people to interact and learn about other things beneath their feet and a bit of history. So I'm just going to check whether I've got any other questions sent to me from there. No. Anything on the public one? So is there anything else anybody wanted to ask just before I finish up? I've just gone on the public chat. Oh, there we go. Thanks very much to the RSC people in the chat too for answering questions. Brilliant. Thank you, guys. As I say, I wasn't in the RSC. You've got some guys on, ladies and gentlemen who were in the Observer Corps who actually did it at the time. So they're probably a lot more knowledgeable than I was. But I hope I've given them a bit of other people a bit of an insight as to what they've done. Lovely. Well, thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed this evening. Continue to stay safe and sensible out there. And hopefully Ed and I will see you down at the post at Cuckfield at some point soon. Thanks very much for watching.